I decided to phrase the topic of my talk, which is broadly about schizophrenia, as a schizophrenia opportunity. And the gist of what I'll say is that we have, understandably, given the history of this concept, gotten schizophrenia really quite wrong for the majority of the life of the concept, viewing it as a very pessimistic, dire, and oftentimes irrecoverable condition, and the data actually never have substantiated that view. And increasingly, it's clear that this is not so much a disaster as it is an opportunity. We have tremendous potential between folks in this room and folks in the medical field to really rescue a good portion of a generation and give them function which has been heretofore unbelievable. I work with the best practices in Schizophrenia Treatment Center, generally supported by the Margaret Clark Morgan Foundation, and our goal is to improve the lives of as many people with schizophrenia as possible, as quickly as possible. So why, again, this is the outline. These are if you can take these and go home if you wish, but here are my points. What we've thought about, how we've thought about schizophrenia for almost the entire 150 years of the concept has been overly skewed toward the pessimistic, to the point it was from the beginning kind of unreasonable, and that's no longer the case. We now know today, well, we've known all along that recovery is the rule. The majority, more than 50% of people with schizophrenia will recover regardless of almost anything else that happens. With modern understandings, with early intervention, with appropriate use of evidence-based practices, we can get that number substantially higher, and the degree of recovery can be from able to live as somebody who's cared for by a loved one to being the head of a household, being being employed, even being a professor of law. The other key point is that this all depends upon early intervention. So just like heart attacks or just like strokes, when we see signs of psychosis, we need to recognize this as a neurological emergency. The time frame for recovery from heart attack is within minutes. The time frame to recover function from stroke is optimally 3 hours. So with schizophrenia, we have a bit of more relaxed time frame on the order of weeks. But still, this is a neurological emergency requiring urgent intervention and referral to appropriate care. If we get them early, we can rescue them. This is an important message for everybody, and it's particularly important message for folks in this audience because, not infrequently, law enforcement or the justice system can be the first point of contact that somebody who is experiencing the first episode of psychosis can have with what I call social institutions, schools, hospitals, doctors, police, and so forth. And if we can coordinate, if we can effectively recognize people who are in the beginning stages of psychosis, and if we can effectively coordinate our resources, everybody wins. There will be less occupancy of police cars and jail beds by people who ought to be occupying clinic seats and then going back to school. Costs go down, life quality goes up. We're better than any point in history poised to drastically change how we think about the schizophrenia spectrum of disease. So to understand where we've been and where we are and where we can go, I want to take you way back and talk about how we got to the schizophrenia concept and where the points of error in our understanding have been born. So let's go back to the French Revolution. Prior to that, at that point it was the Age of Enlightenment. Prior to the French Revolution, the care of what were termed then in those days the insane was largely under the control of state bureaucracies, lawyers or specialized magistrates to deal with people who were not able to fit in with conventional society and so forth. Following the French Revolution, the idea was to take the care of the mentally ill out of the hands of the police and to put it into the hands of doctors. There were certainly no shortage of doctors in those days who knew for centuries that there are probably diseases, back in those days we didn't understand the nature of any disease, but that some diseases which we don't understand probably do manifest in changes of mood or behavior or communication. So rather than viewing these people as morally corrupt or somehow less, we should simply view them as ill people and treat them to the best of our ability with whatever medical technologies we can offer. So with this sort of change of attitude from being something that we should punish or contain into something that we should treat, there came an elaboration of large hospitals similar to the tuberculosis sanitarium in those days. The rationale being that we don't really understand how to cure TB, but we do know that adequate shelter, clean water, good food, fresh air, moderate exercise, things that generally promote health will promote recovery. And the same concept was applied with actually a great deal of reason to the care of the mentally ill. And with the formation of these very large institutions of care, you had, if you will, a new breed of doctor, my forebears, the beginnings of psychiatry, and they were looking at all these different manifestations of behavior affecting illness, and the task of that era was to categorize these things. There must be different disease states that result in different kinds of symptoms, and so they took detailed notes. And if you go back, I like to tell people we've been practicing psychiatry for about 200 years, the majority with no medicine, but a lot of pens, and so we could write down lots of things. So it became apparent by 1850 that there was a pattern of illness that seemed to strike when people were young, and it seemed to involve a significant reduction of the ability to function. It was kind of pervasive in the domains of function and existence that this illness affected. It got the very unfortunate name of early dementia, in French, demence précoce, in German, in German/Latin, dementia praecox. So between 1850 to the close of the 19th century was the establishment and the descriptions of this disease, which had this really pejorative name. And this was the beginning of a very bad thing. In fact, a brief aside, this guy, famous figure in the history of psychiatry, Emil Kraepelin, he wrote that this is a early onset, progressively deteriorating disorder. When Kraepelin looked to see what's the long-term outcome of people with this diagnosis that he came up with, he began to find that maybe about 20% appeared to completely recover. He then simply recategorized them and said, no, that's impossible. This is a disease where people don't recover, so I was wrong for the first time, and he put them out. So his recovery rate from his refining of his diagnosis or his tautologies was that less than 1% will regain function. But again, he skewed the deck in favor of his preconceived belief. Then, if that wasn't bad enough, then we came around to the beginning of the 20th century with a Swiss guy who went from early dementia to splitting of the mind. Bleuler was impressed by, in his words, there's sort of a separation between maybe what person says and how their emotional responses are. So he thought this involved some splitting of the various mental faculties. He was very much in the shadow of Sigmund Freud, who had all these theories going around quite popularly about subconscious forces. And he also inherited this extreme pessimism from Kraepelin and so forth. So it was really a double whammy of doom, and also wrong. Later in his life, Bleuler went to look at his patients, and he never completed the work. He concluded that the patients that he saw, the ones in his hospitals, never left, so he thought it was probably along the lines of this dastardly deteriorating illness. His son picked up the work and found that 40% of Bleuler's original patients left the asylum and went on to have families and meaningful work and standing in society of various forms. And so a rudimentary definition of adequate functional recovery. 40% with no medications whatsoever and with no understanding of the illness. So we can do a lot better, but we're burdened by, for example, what this guy, Patrick McGorry, who is a leading figure in the treatment of schizophrenia in early stages, has observed that these were serious misconceptions. They were, with retrospective knowledge, incorrect, and they were just strategically wrong. And the shadow of this pessimism really can't be underestimated. I finished my PhD in pharmacology in 1991. I read the standard book of the day pharmacology textbook like 4 times to pass my oral exams. And I was from 1991, top of line, convinced that schizophrenia is a progressive, deteriorating illness, and that these medicines, which got the nickname major tranquilizers, worked, if you can call it working, by sedating people so that they no longer were bothered by these symptoms. And I mean, this is a 1991 PhD graduate in pharmacology looking from top of the line books. Still, and in medical school from 1997 and so forth, still the dominant view is that this is a progressively deteriorating illness. And so therefore you can't, if doctors think that, then I will excuse the rest of society for having these beliefs, because I think it comes from the source. But just think about this. When have you ever in your life seen a media portrayal, either in a movie, television series, or a news report, of somebody with schizophrenia who is a husband and father of 3, or who has a job, or who does substantial contributions to the life of his community? I think probably never. Rather, you see them, if they're portrayed at all, as people who are likely to be homeless, likely to be unpredictable, shifty, violence-prone, switching from one personality to another. These are all, well, we don't tolerate such stereotypical attitudes when it comes to ethnicity or skin color, yet we still, this goes on unchecked in media. So it's a pervasive and very unhelpful view. In fact, violence is quite rare in people with schizophrenia. The best of data suggests that people with schizophrenia have no higher risk of violence than the general population, or if you look at the entirety of studies, it may be at best 2-fold elevated from a relatively low percentage of people in the population that have violence. There is no multiple personality or splitting of anything involved in schizophrenia. And medications actually, when done well, don't need to cause sedation, and they can more often than not be given without any significant side effect burden at all. From the 1940s, we learned that the majority of people recover, and study after study after study since that time has confirmed that at minimum half will recover, and we can do much better than that these days. So I would like to tell you more about what schizophrenia is, and I think to better understand what schizophrenia is, we're going to take a look a bit in depth at one of its major symptoms, that is called psychosis. So what is, and to understand psychosis, I want to now make you sort of like entry-level neurologists for a few minutes. This is a diagram of the human brain. The areas that are colored have direct connections to things that you can observe externally. So your senses, your ability to move, your ability to communicate verbally or in writing or to understand language, all these things that have direct connections to visibly obvious functions are a really tiny portion of the brain. I mean, this, that's about it. This area, this massive place called the frontal lobe, you can have gigantic tumors here and nobody will know it. It's not connected to anything that you can see. Similarly, temporal lobe, you can have big tumors there and you might get epilepsy, but many tumors go undetected in that region. So many areas of the brain can be completely damaged and have no outward sign. Neurologists call those portions of the brain silent because there's no outward obvious communication with them. What your brain does with all that quiet real estate is really quite remarkable. So brain represents about 2% of the mass of the body, yet consumes 20% of the oxygen of the body. So all the calories you burn in a day, 1/5 of them is devoted to brain activity. Why does it do so much? Because it has this massive, massive job of connecting all these inputs from the external world, as well as the millions of inputs from every cell inside your body, and making sense of everything. So these things just get a stream of clicks from the electrical signal bursts, and from just a whole bunch of different electrical streams, we're every millisecond of the day constructing a representation of the external world. This is a massive task, which requires 20% of the energy that you burn. So all this stuff, all of this stuff does what I call integrating. You take these various raw inputs, you put them together, and you synthesize higher and higher levels of meaning and understanding out of them, integrative functions. Most of your brain is involved in integrating and constructing representations. So because it's so massive in terms of number of connections, because it's so complicated, and because it's such a high energy organ, this is totally ripe for things to go wrong. And of course, there's no shortage of things where, no shortage of accidents could happen. So brain disease is destined. I mean, we almost can't avoid it to be, run by an organ of that complexity. And when that happens, not infrequently, we call it psychosis. So psychosis is can result from anything that shifts the brain off of its normal processing routines. So slight perturbations of nervous system function can result in unusual perceptions or misperceptions. And that's essentially what psychosis is a slight shift in the integrative functions of the organ. Common symptoms of psychosis include suspiciousness, paranoia, delusions, which are beliefs that are deeply held but seem to be not supported by external ideas, hallucinations, disorganization of thought, or unusual behavior. So those are, it could be probably more things, but these are the general typical cluster of symptoms that we call psychosis these days. And as I said, if you like me have worked in hospitals and you do rounds and consulting in intensive care units, or when people are really ill, you'll be convinced that every single one of us has it wired in us to experience psychosis. It is extremely common. Another way of tilting the brain towards psychotic function is to give people amphetamine. Believe it or not, these experiments were done in the 1950s. They take people who are stone cold normal, and they just kept giving them amphetamine, and about 100% of volunteers experienced something that looked indistinguishable from schizophrenia-like psychosis. So it's an endemic capacity of our human brains to have psychosis mode function. There are many, many causes, but a dominant one that ties together a lot of symptoms nicely involves unusual or inappropriate release of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine functions as commonly said to be a reward chemical. Probably more accurate is to be calling it a salience or a relevance chemical. So when we're expecting something to happen and it happens, dopamine is released in certain circuits that perceive relevance. When we're not expecting something to happen and something happens, then again you get those circuits of relevance charging, and dopamine mediates some of those signals. So dopamine is released when we're seeing something kind of important. So now imagine a situation where your dopamine is being released inappropriately, or in situations when there's really nothing new or unusual happening. You get the sensation like that. I look at that sign there, and if I'm having a release of dopamine, I think that there's something really significant at that sign. It feels like there ought to be something there, but I can't quite make out why is it why should that be so important? And when this happens again and again, like if I look in this direction to this person, and then I get this surge, like something important happened, and I notice that she's looking at me, maybe I start to make a connection that, well, there's something to this thing. And so then our brains are designed, the other thing our brains do is to try to make reasons for everything. So when we have all these hits of, that seems just really, and I can't figure it out, then I begin to weave stories about why it is that sign is so significant when it ought not to be. And so that's the beginning of, it can be suspiciousness, it can be things just seem unusual. And as it goes on, then it gets bigger, and then you get to, and then stress happens. And so when the world's giving you all these weird signals, you become more stressed. And the other thing we've learned is that when people who are psychosis prone are under stress, they have a lot more psychosis symptoms. So it begins to be a snowball. So that's psychosis 101. As I said, if you work in hospitals, you'll be convinced that every single one of us can experience psychosis. If you ask Americans in survey form, have you ever experienced hallucinations or extraordinary suspiciousness or a feeling that something's not quite real? You'll find that people who are willing to admit, yes, tally 9% of our brothers and sisters in this country. And those are people who are willing to admit it. So I figure that probably in reality it's more than 10% of people will experience at least one psychosis-like experience during the course of their ordinary life. Again, we're wired for this. And the studies also show that about 10%, and again probably more, of people going through ordinary adolescence will experience a psychosis-like symptom. And as I said, it's something that we can all of us can get. So with that in place, then what is schizophrenia? Schizophrenia is essentially the name we give to conditions in which psychosis is persistent or regularly recurring. So one-off bout of hallucinations or suspiciousness is, well, something happened, but we're not going to really figure that out. But if it happens more than once, or it happens for days at a time, it's a medical thing. And if we can't find any other explanation for it, then if it goes on long enough, we can call it schizophrenia or schizophrenia spectrum. In addition to psychotic symptoms, then to diagnose somebody with schizophrenia, you usually see a cluster of other symptoms, among them a decline in functioning. None of these are obligatory, but it's quite common to see what we call negative symptoms: social withdrawal, apathy, lack of attention to hygiene, lack of interest in surroundings. It's not uncommon, but again, not obligatory, that people will experience difficulty with ways of thinking that used to be easy for them. A kid that I met one time in the hospital was, I believe, going into his junior year studying biochemistry at an Ivy League university, and he told me the first thing that happened to him was that he opened his textbook and none of the words made sense to him. He recognized them as words, but the way that he would think about them was completely lost. So his initial symptom was that of a cognitive impairment. Which then he spun into, and he made an explanation for that the only thing that made sense, even though he understood this is far-fetched, would be that somebody's messing with his brain and causing him to interpret like the opposite meaning of the words that were printed on the page, and so forth. So cognitive symptoms are not uncommon. And this. Other medical causes need to be ruled out. So I say, a bit tongue-in-cheek, it's not schizophrenia until it's not anything else. And so when we encounter somebody with these symptoms, we should view them as, I said, a neurological emergency, deserving an entire, complete medical evaluation. Why? Because I'm going to show you 2 slides full of things that can cause symptoms that resemble schizophrenia. And in many cases, you're not going to recognize these things until you do the right kind of examination and testing. These are conditions, about 55 of them, I believe, which we can treat. So if we catch them early, we can treat them, everything's good. These are conditions which, unfortunately, we're not able to fully treat to remission, but at least if you know what's going on, then you save somebody a whole bunch of pain and unnecessary treatment by recognizing that they have some other disease and they can get the right kind of care, even if that care is going to be mostly palliative. It will at least be done with higher levels of dignity and without exposure to the drugs that would be unnecessary. So, and this slide helps to understand why this is so vitally important to do complete medical workups. And why I'm making this a big point is because with discomforting frequency, you will find people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia treated as one with schizophrenia who turn out to have something that wasn't schizophrenia. And this is how common that can happen. In one consecutive series, 12% of people admitted to hospital turned out to have a medical disorder that was either the cause or significantly exacerbating their symptoms. If you look more narrowly at people who are having their first episode of psychosis, and this looks like it's going to go down the pathway to a first episode of schizophrenia, well, 5 or 7% will have medical diseases which are causing those symptoms. So if we want to turn the page and rescue lives, we can be really diligent at doing the right kind of assessments. And in one of these studies, this one, they found these were the leading causes of schizophrenia-like psychosis. Syphilis, sarcoid is a kind of where you form these granules in tissues. Autoimmune diseases and inflammatory disorders are extremely common, and tumors in the brain. The point is that there's many things can cause it. So why is this an opportunity? Because if we do the right assessment, and if we get treatment early, we can have higher degrees of recovery and higher magnitudes of recovery. So I will show you data in a second that show the importance of early treatment and the very deleterious effect of delaying treatment. But these are some data from our experience. At NEOMED, we help community mental health centers organize clinics which are specializing in the treatment of early psychosis. And our time frame is we will enroll people within the first 18 months of illness. So if you can get people within that relatively broad window, it turns out that by 6 months in the program, 99% are housed. 93% are completely devoid of any run-ins with the law. Employment rates go substantially up from baseline to 6 months of treatment. Family relationships or social relationships improve, going from at baseline 67% reporting that they get along with folks to 99 or 92%. Hospitalization rates drop, and people are able to complete their education and go on to work. So those are local, and all we're doing is we're helping ordinary community health centers just deploy resources that they can find to do so effectively and using relatively easy to follow evidence-based practices. And here's another example of what you can do with the right timing and the right medicine. So this is, I'd like you to meet Bethany Yeiser. She lives around Cincinnati. She bravely has disclosed her story and recently published an essay about her work, about her recovery in the academic journal Schizophrenia Bulletin. This is her timeline that she published on her website. So she goes to university. She does quite good. She publishes papers in microbiology and molecular biology. Toward the end of her college years, she began to decline. She couldn't. She said she was going to take an exam which she thought was going to be easy, and then she got back the exam and she completely failed it. And so this was an example of the cognitive impairment being an early sign. This ultimately led to homelessness, and then for behaviors or actions while homeless, twice jailed. So as I said, the first point of encounter can oftentimes be law enforcement or the justice system. Eventually, she was hospitalized. She recovered. She goes back to the University of Cincinnati, gets honors degree, and is writing and advocating for people who are affected with schizophrenia. Incidentally, she reports that she had a number of different medications that were used, and in the end, she was provided a medication called Clozapine. And in her words, before Clozapine she could read, but after Clozapine she could study. So Clozapine really unlocked, it helped her to recover a great deal of her cognitive capacities, and she's a bright and fabulous individual and continues to take Clozapine. I would like you also to meet, if you haven't known already, Ellen Sachs, an attorney. She's a professor of law at University of Southern California. She recently wrote a book, The Center Cannot Hold, in which she describes her experience of schizophrenia. She, as well, ultimately was given Clozapine and experienced the highest level of recovery with that medicine, and is another example of why the myth about this is this dastardly, awful illness and nobody gets better is just wrong. People can do outstanding things even if they have schizophrenia. Of course, you have to have a Dr. Sachs is where she is because she won the genetic lottery and had a good brain and was doing well prior to. So we're not going to take somebody who has an IQ of 100, average intelligence, and turn them into a USC professor as a result of treatment. But you can achieve very close to what you were originally born with. You can maximize, we can help people to get their fullest expression of capacity when we can meet them early and give them the right kind of treatment. As I said, it's a time-sensitive issue. One of the reasons why schizophrenia was seen as this progressively deteriorating illness from which few people ever recover is because when it was first recognized, it was recognized amongst people who had been ill for a very long time, and the ones who got better left the hospital, but the ones who stayed were observed by the doctors, and so they had this very pessimistic view. But it's true again and again that we see that the longer somebody is ill, the lower the likelihood of recovery is going to be, and the lower the degree of that recovery will be. This is such a reliable observation that time spent in illness translates into productivity and life quality lost, that the National Institutes of Health is really focused on trying to reduce what they call the duration of untreated psychosis. It's a variable that we can modify, and if we modify it, we can achieve cost reductions and life quality improvement. From the NIH data, we see that this is a measure of life quality scale. The higher on the y-axis means better quality of life. This curve is for people that had a short, and by short I mean 1.5 years or less, duration of untreated illness and got appropriate care. And these other lines, the dotted ones, are the results of the extent of life quality improvement if the preceding illness duration had been more than 1.5 years. So longer illness, lower life quality improvement. This graph shows you symptom severity. So high is bad symptoms and low is lesser symptoms. The bottom axis is 55. And to put this in perspective, this particular scale called PANS, the lowest, it has 30 questions. The lowest score you can get on any one question is 1. So everybody in this room has a PANS score of at least 30. To rate a 2, you have to have symptoms that are maybe within the realm of normal, not quite sure. A 3 is clearly things are different. So if we all scored 2 on the PANS, where every item is maybe normal, maybe a little bit exaggerated, we would get a score of 60. So a score of 55 is actually quite good for this symptom instrument. And again, the highest degree of recovery occurs with the group in the solid line that have the shortest duration of illness. And the best recovery happened when that short duration of illness was teamed with appropriate coordinated specialty care. So time is of the essence. And I hope I will advocate here that psychiatry should adopt something like, you've all seen this slogan, right? The neurologists have done an excellent job of telling us that our brain is precious, and that if we see symptoms that look like a stroke, run to the nearest emergency department and get evaluated, because time lost is brain lost. We can actually intervene early in the stage of this neurological condition and rescue brain material and confer higher levels of function. Exactly. There's no difference. The brain is the brain. It's a neurological organ. So we need to stop thinking about schizophrenia or psychosis as a mental problem and see it for what it is. It's a neurological disorder in which the portions of the brain, the vast portions of the brain that do the integration, that construct this higher levels of perception, there is something going wrong in all those circuits. It could be any number of things. But it's a neurological problem at heart. So it requires urgent and comprehensive medical assessment, and to either find the medical causes directly, or if it's going to turn out to be schizophrenia, to get them to the right kind of care and the right kind of medicines. The great news is that if we intervene early, the success rate from any psychotropic medication or any antipsychotic medication is about 80%. So 80% of people, no matter what medicine they're given, will have a significant reduction of their symptoms of psychosis if they're caught early and treated well. I probably won't go into it now, but schizophrenia, there's many causes of psychosis, and therefore there are actually many kinds of schizophrenia. Not all schizophrenias are going to be so fabulous responsive. About 20% of the population, between 20 and 30% of the population with schizophrenia have a form of illness that looks just like the other kind, but it actually is non-responsive to the usual medications. So that group has, again, my field needs to change itself. We call that, unfortunately, treatment-resistant schizophrenia, which is a misnomer because we can actually treat those people very well. They just don't respond to the more customary kinds of medicines. They do respond fabulously well to this one called Clozapine. So a few words about clozapine. Clozapine is the world's most effective treatment for psychosis and schizophrenia. This graph, it shows a construct, a statistical concept called effect size. Effect size is a way that you can look at research outcome data and put them on the same playing field even though they're from different studies. It's kind of like RBI or something like that. It's a way you can standardize hitting performance across different baseball teams. So the effect size for most of the antipsychotic drugs ranges from 0.4 to just under 0.6. This is par for the course for psychotropic medications. The effect size for Prozac or any first-line antidepressant drug to treat depression is about 0.5 to 0.6. In contrast, the effect size of 0.9 is something you see in the use of stimulants to treat ADHD. It's a higher reliability effect. And as far as medicines that affect psychiatric function, this is really a monstrously high effect size. It's unfortunate that it only goes to that level, but it's a truly huge difference. So clozapine is world's best medicine by far. Not only that, but clozapine is unique in the United States, and it is the only drug that the FDA has recognized as effective at reducing suicide. And suicide risk in psychosis and schizophrenia is prodigious. About half of people with schizophrenia spectrum disorders will attempt to end their life, and lifetime risk for completed suicide is 1 in 10. So 1 in 10 people with schizophrenia currently will end their life at their own hand, which is underappreciated statistics. So yeah, go ahead.
So is clozapine effective for everyone or just for this so-called treatment-resistant schizophrenia spectrum?
Yeah, clozapine would a great question, and yeah, I will have some time so we can open up. Ask me all your questions. I would love to help you understand to the extent that you wish to, anything that you wish to know about schizophrenia. But clozapine is effective for all schizophrenias. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to fail the medicine you don't have to fail medicines in order to be deemed treatment resistant and get clozapine. You will likely do well on clozapine even as a first-line treatment. One of the things with clozapine, though, and why it's not used to the extent that it really ought to be, is because it can cause the bone marrow to lose the production of white cells. And when it was first on the market, they didn't know that this was going to be a serious side effect, and a handful of people died because they lost their white cells and they couldn't fight infections, and they died from infections that otherwise would have been prevented. So it was pulled off the market at that point. And because nothing could replace it, it eventually came back on the market with the expectation that a person has a weekly blood test to check their white cell count. So it's reserved for people who don't get better with other things because it has that side effect, which is seen as more difficult to manage. Turns out that actually white cell numbers can go down from a whole bunch of other drugs, but clozapine is the one that is starred for that. So it would be, if I were to have schizophrenia, I would probably make it my number 2 choice. I wouldn't want to fail 2 or 3 medicines to get on the medicine. I would go to probably as a number 2. But yeah, it can be used for anything. And also in suicide reduction, it can reduce suicide not only in schizophrenia, but in bipolar disorder. And I'll show it a little bit later. It can be actually very effective at reducing aggressive and violent behaviors. And reduction of aggression and violence can occur across psychiatric diagnosis. So if it's schizophrenia or mania or even borderline personality disorder, clozapine actually has reports to say that it can reduce aggression, and in the case of borderline personality, it can reduce episodes of self-harm as well. So it's a remarkable drug. But in suicide reduction in schizophrenia, this is suicide rate for people with schizophrenia. This is suicide rate for people with schizophrenia treated on clozapine, and this is suicide rate for everybody else. In this well-designed and big study, you lost the suicide risk. You become an average Joe in terms of liability to commit suicide when treated with clozapine. So it's really remarkable. And one reason to talk about clozapine is because we don't use it nearly as much as we ought to. This thing that has the misnomer diagnosis, treatment-resistant schizophrenia, accounts for, on average, 30% of all schizophrenias. That's a conservative estimate. We'll say 30%. So we know that of that, people who are so-called treatment-resistant, that about 60% of people with that condition will find that clozapine is, 1, easy to tolerate, and 2, effective. So let's make that success rate 50% to be also conservative. So 30% of people with schizophrenia have the disease form that clozapine ought to treat, and half of those will get better. So given that, you would say we should have 15% of people with schizophrenia on clozapine. And in Ohio, following the national average, we have only about 4% of our patients with schizophrenia on clozapine, translating into 11% who would benefit from it but aren't given that advantage. And factoring in suicidality, then and the population of Ohio, that translates to almost 13,000 Ohioans whose lives are at risk from completed suicide that could be prevented by clozapine, and factoring in a 1 in 10 lifetime risk, that's 1,000 lives lost just from not using the medicine where we ought to. There are many, many, many reasons why we're underutilizing clozapine, but for this audience, I'll talk about one gap, if you will, or one link in the chain. Is that clozapine is really a standalone. There is nothing else like it on planet Earth. It cannot be replaced. If somebody enters a jail and they are taking clozapine, many jails in Ohio don't offer clozapine. They'll switch into something different. And that's unfortunate because almost invariably that person is going to have a relapse of their psychotic illness. And the other thing, why long psychotic interval, remember, long durations of psychosis are very damaging. They have lower levels of outcome. Another sobering fact about having a psychotic relapse is if you've had a relapse of your symptoms after you've been stable, every relapse gives you a 1 in 6 probability that you won't get better after that. So it can become a permanent and extremely difficult condition to treat, and relapses sort of builds the stairway higher each step going to a poorer outcome. So preventing relapse is rule number 1, and if a person on clozapine in the community is in a jail or prison and can't have access to clozapine, it risks getting worse. And to the extent that there is rationale for this, the most common rationale is it's too expensive, which is false. Clozapine probably is about $400 a month for the medicine, and the blood tests are probably $10. Well, it depends upon what contract rate you can get, but it's between $7 to $20 for a blood test every week. It can be a little problematic to use because you have to do a blood test every week. And the other faulty rationale for this is that all antipsychotics are equally effective, so we'll just get them from one to another. And again, this is even though it's called antipsychotic drug, is really a standalone medicine. It can't be duplicated by other things. And so there's that, potential interruption of treatment. And there's also, if we want to think very boldly, we could see there's a clozapine opportunity because people with schizophrenia and psychotic disorders are unfortunately overrepresented in incarcerated populations, and it's likely that, I actually don't know, but I would wager that there's going to be a higher prevalence of so-called treatment-resistant individuals in that population. So if we can offer clozapine to that type of person in that setting, we can create miracles. I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen in-state hospital settings. I've seen people who have been severely ill, multiple rounds of homeless and drug abuse, and every social evil that you can imagine has been visited upon them for decades. And then, regrettably, I'm the first person that it would appear to have suggested using clozapine. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen just, it really is miraculous. People that everybody had written off as just, they're just that way. They can, for the first time in their life, participate actively in discharge planning. They can maintain their emotions. They can feel comfortable around people. There was a study done in the UK of a large number of people with schizophrenia who had used clozapine, and they asked them broadly, you, clozapine benefiting person, would you go back to some other medicine? And 90% of them said, no way, I'm going to stick with clozapine. And this despite the fact that many of them would experience side effects. Clozapine is a very side effect-laden drug, but despite the side effects, they would stay with clozapine. And when the sample was asked, what is it about clozapine that you like? This was the thing, this is the thing. I like it because I think 55 to 60% said it helps me to socialize with others. It helps me to feel comfortable. It helps me to, in some cases, get a job, to maintain independent living. You know, it really, it's nice if we can reduce, say, paranoia by a few points on the scale, but what we're really shooting for is, can a person, can they get their life back? And clozapine actually offers that more than any other medicine ever has. It's really, if you see somebody who's gone from decades of illness to now being somebody that you wouldn't recognize as ever having been ill, I can't underemphasize how remarkable this medication is and how unique. So, you know, in incarcerated settings where there are probably large numbers of people who are not getting adequate benefit from formulary antipsychotic drugs, there would be a fabulous opportunity to get them to levels of engagement and planning that have been unimaginable prior to that. Also, studies have been done. I mean, this is a as I mentioned earlier, it's not only a suicide-reducing drug, it's an aggression-reducing drug. And there was a study done in a prison system showing that people with clozapine had higher employability and lower rates of reoffending when they were treated with clozapine in the incarceration setting. So those are the end of the comments I have, and we'll be really happy to take any questions or open up for other discussions.
And in thinking broadly about why people aren't using clozapine to the degree that they probably should, another factor is comfortingly common is that the prescribers may not have been trained in it. It went generic in the 90s, and because it was a bit cumbersome to use, and because we had a lot of competition from branded medicines, then a whole generation of prescribers sort of lacked the experience. So if it turns out that prescribers in whatever setting are reluctant or fearful, then we at NEOMED are completely able to provide assistance and consultation to help address that and build, support people as they gain that knowledge and experience.
So it's not tied to one particular pharmaceutical company now?
No, that's generically, it's been generically available for a long time. Yes?
What about those that are on Thorazine? Is there a way that you can wean them off and give them the appropriate medicine so they can start enjoying their life a little bit more better? This is talking about institution-wise.
Yeah. With any medicine, there are two parts to answer that question. If a person is taking Thorazine and is doing well, then there's probably not a need to change. But I think you asked this question because people are taking Thorazine and they're experiencing maybe they're only partially improved and they are dealing with many side effects. And in that case, yeah, it's relatively easy and certainly ought to be tried because there are many options besides that medicine, and clozapine certainly can be one of them. Yes.
You talked about reduction, like blood cell reduction is one of the side effects. Could you talk about some of the other primary side effects that you have to be concerned about?
From clozapine? Yeah. The one you have to be most concerned about actually is constipation. Seriously, the highest cause of death from clozapine use is consequences related to constipation. That's oftentimes overlooked, but it's really it's relatively easy to deal with. So the constipation is weirdly the most potentially lethal of them. Clozapine side effects are generally in the order of sedation. There can be a impairment of the swallowing reflex, so people will sometimes drool. There can be feeling lightheaded when one stands up and getting dizzy, perhaps fainting. Those would be the most common ones that come to mind, and most of them have workarounds. I tell everybody that the only reason I'm going to ask you, dear patient of mine, to take this medicine is because I want to give you a really awesome life, and you're going to tell me, please keep this medicine because either you get great results and that justify the side effects, but it's your only goal to seek the lowest possible dose, and if the side effect is unavoidable, there are workarounds for that. So many of these common side effects from clozapine, there are many ways to obviate them so that they either don't exist or become significantly.
Titrate the dosages to get the proper level.
Right.
How long is that titration period?
That could several weeks. Ideally, if there's no set duration to go from 0 to therapeutic dose. There's also, it's not really clear exactly what a therapeutic dose is going to be for a particular individual. But broadly speaking, it would be around, say, 400 to 600 milligrams per day. And we would start doing 25 milligrams a day or 12 and a half milligrams a day. And if I have all things being equal, I would like to do that increase over the course of several months. Because that you reduce the risk that they're going to have something that makes them feel like this is a bad thing we should do to them.
And why did they decide that this is a drug of last resort? So I assume you have to use a fail first or a step therapy process. Is there a reason?
When it was initially taken off the market because of the white blood cell problems, it came back on the market with a great deal of trepidation on the part of the FDA. And they said, well, you're only going to be able to use this if this and this and this. So that was it was spooky drug when it came back on the market. And so the general consensus guideline about when is clozapine appropriate is after 2 attempts to use any other medicine that have failed. So you don't have to wait for 2 failed attempts, but it's a reasonable goal. And with antipsychotic medications, it takes a certain duration of time and an adequate dose to be effective. And the 3 months to 4 months of adequate dosing is the definition of adequate duration. So if we followed evidence-based practice to a T, you would have somebody who had signs of schizophrenia and they were brought into treatment within the first 6 months, ideally. They would be given, choose any antipsychotic drug that you wish, and they would have an 80% likelihood of having a very significant response. But if they fail, then you call failure after 4 months. Then you try medicine number 2, and in that case, it would be very, very useful to give a long-acting injectable form so that you can make sure that the drug is adequate a dose for that next 4 months. But if after 4 more months they're not to where they ought to be, then you have a total of 8 months from intake to now, and so they ought to be offered clozapine by 8 months. And what the real data shows is that it can be many, many years, in my experience, decades, before that happens, and that's very unfortunate because it was said the longer you stick using psychosis, the worse your outcome is going to be. So if we did it well, everybody would be either well or offered clozapine by 8 months of treatment. Yes.
A quick comment. My better half has Crohn's disease, and there's that same concern about a medicine that has done really well, the white blood cell, and there are workarounds, and it can be managed. And I just think it's kind of interesting that in that case there isn't, the same kind of focus as perhaps, on this medicine. The other thing, I'm wondering, you mentioned bipolar or BPD. Is there continuing studies or looking at how this does help those as well?
Yeah, the use of clozapine in bipolar disorder would be considered off-label. It was not an FDA-recognized use of the medicine. But the medical literature and science to support that use is vast. And similar to schizophrenia, it can be an ideal medicine when other bipolar treatments have failed. In the setting, in the borderline personality disorder, there are really just a handful of studies done by a single investigator using a comparatively small number of individuals. And although it's an extraordinarily important problem, the scientific community around that has not really coalesced to bring that database up to speed. But the things that you can read in the small studies that have been done are really quite impressive as to what those can do for self-injury in that condition. Yes?
So many of the agencies that are here today, we're all dealing with the opiate heroin epidemic in Ohio. For individuals who are going through an addiction, are you seeing presentations of those individuals with psychoses? Do they eventually turn into like a full-blown schizophrenia or something from the drug use?
Yeah. That's a great question, and with some interesting points to answer with. So if you look at all drugs of abuse and what is their ability to cause psychosis or to have something that looks like schizophrenia as a result of that drug use, opiates are actually, this sounds weird to say, surprisingly safe with respect to psychosis risk. There's a very small minority of the population who, when given an opiate, they absolutely will develop paranoia. I've seen it in consultations, but it's quite rare. But if you look at large populations, the likelihood that schizophrenia arises in association with a circumscribed opiate addiction is essentially the same as for population. It's no significant signal for opiates. That's not the case with stimulants or with marijuana. In the case of amphetamine, that's a very high risk. You give a person about a 3 to 6-fold higher likelihood of experiencing a persistent psychosis that looks like schizophrenia in the population of amphetamine users. And can't resist, but the pharmaceutical companies have brought us all the second generation of stimulants for ADHD and are now telling us that ADHD can be all sorts of subtle things. Their clinical studies say that psychosis occurs at a rate of about 0.25% from therapeutically prescribed stimulants. But 2 studies from Canada in ADHD treatment centers suggest that the risk of psychosis from therapeutic doses of stimulants may be as high as 5%. I've seen psychosis from therapeutic stimulant use with great regularity. And the other surprise entity in the Drug Use and Schizophrenia Association is cannabis. It's cannabis. The odds that you get schizophrenia in somebody who uses cannabis is about 3 to 4 times the general population signal. People who use cannabis people who have schizophrenia and who use cannabis have significantly earlier age of onset of schizophrenia. The risk of schizophrenia increases in proportion to the total dose of cannabis. It is, and a really fabulous study was done recently in which they looked at all people with schizophrenia, cannabis users and not, and they looked for 10 other genes that have association with schizophrenia. If the idea is that cannabis is innocuous and cannabis has no relation to schizophrenia, you would expect the 10 other genes to have equal prevalence in the cannabis users and non-users. That's not what they found. They found that the expected schizophrenia risk genes were present in the schizophrenia non-cannabis using group, but they were significantly less present in the cannabis using group. So it's at the stage where it was with tobacco in the 1940s. Doctors are convinced that cigarettes cause cancer, even though society is kind of still thinking it's safe and medicinal. But the way that cannabis is now, everybody who works in psychosis is absolutely convinced that cannabis creates a situation that looks exactly like schizophrenia. And the data is accumulating to support that, but the general public attitudes are far behind still.
I'm thinking of changes in nomenclature away from, in other fields and away from some kind of pejorative. If the word schizophrenia is misleading both in its, not only its connotation, but its denotation, and it's very semantics, whatever, then why not just come up with a different word?
They did that in Japan. They call it integrative disorder now. And stigma went down and engagement in treatment went up.
Why not do it in this country? I mean, for instance,
it's the next. It's set to go. It certainly needs to happen, but and it's just beginning to build some supporting medical literature. I think within our lifetime, and hopefully within the next 10 years, we'll see it changed. But I think we'll move slow.